in one moment, I will hand over the floor to our IAP Presidents, Volker Meulen and Depei. They will just give some quick words of welcome. Then we'll go through a series of 3 presentations from Toni Gabaldón, from Peggy, Hamburg, and from Biljana, Gjoneska. Then we'll take a short break, and we'll come back in part 2 with the final sort of formal presentation before going into the discussion session. So I hope we have plenty of time for that discussion. And we hope to try and answer all your questions. And there we have a special guest, Professor Hak-Soo Kim, also an expert in communications. I will introduce the speakers in a little more detail as we proceed. So, but at this point, let me stop sharing and we can hand the microphone to Professor Meulen, IAP President. All yours, Volker.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to this webinar. Although I assume you have used video conferences a lot over the past year, for me it is still a strange situation to have no personal contact with the audience of a webinar or a workshop. Today we want to discuss, how Peter has already indicated, how to counter COVID-19 hesitancy. There is one factor, of course, which may interfere in obtaining herd immunity against this virus. However, achieving herd immunity through vaccination is, as we all know, essential to overcome and control this pandemic. We all have witnessed how quickly scientific efforts have produced several COVID-19 vaccines, which are all effective in mounting a proper humoral and, I assume, also cellular immune response. As a virologist myself, I can say that this is a wonderful and amazing achievement of science and scientific collaboration. Based on this scientific achievement, it is possible that in the near future, the spread of COVID-19 can be controlled if enough people get immunized. However, we know from experiences that in any vaccination effort, there are basically 3 groups of people. Those who proceed to getting vaccinated without hesitancy, those who absolutely oppose any vaccination, and those who are hesitant and need more information or a gentle persuasion in order to accept a vaccine. It is this last group of vaccine hesitant people who we as academies should primarily address to take the COVID-19 vaccine. Vaccine hesitant has been defined by the WHO as, and I quote, delay in acceptance or refusal of vaccine despite availability of a vaccine services. Vaccine hesitancy is complex and context specific, varying across time, place, and vaccines. It is influenced by factors such as complacency, convenience, and confidence, unquote. In this webinar, we will discuss these aspects and address how Academy of Science and Medicine, as trusted and credible voices, can counter such hesitancy. An important question is how to tackle false and misleading claims and how to deal with the fact of their easy availability and extremely fast spreading. We hope that Academy leaders, even if they are not trained in virology or immunology or infectious diseases, along with their communication teams, will take up this call to action and engage in their countries in support of COVID-19 vaccinations. Indeed, after this webinar, we would like to use our discussion today to develop a document with a series of recommendations on how academies can help with vaccine rollouts in their countries. And I wish all of us an interesting 3 hours of discussion on this important topic. Thank you.
So thank you, Volker. And if I can now pass the microphone to Depei, Professor Liu in China, for your remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Volker, for your remarks. First of all, I would like to extend my welcome to all of you to join the webinar. In the context of the global fight against the pandemic, entering the phase of vaccination, today's webinar is very necessary and important. Vaccination is the ultimate weapon against the pandemic and the best route back to normal life. At present, many countries around the world have rolled out a number of vaccines of different platforms. This brings us hope and confidence. But in the meantime, many factors are affecting the global vaccination rates, among which vaccine hesitancy is an important one. At present, it seems that a vaccine rolled out worldwide are generally safe and reliable. But for a variety of reasons, people distrust and refuse to take vaccines, as it actually understandable, particularly when many people with such hesitancy are from outside of the medical field. To eliminate vaccine hesitancy requires scientists to first analyze people's fears about the vaccines and figure out what has led to their hesitancy attitude towards vaccination. On this basis, scientists then need to popularize science and dispel doubts among different social groups from a scientific point of view and in relevant way that the public can understand and accept vaccination. Only in this way could vaccination hesitancy be eliminated more effectively. In this regard, our IAP and IAPH and our member academies should significant responsibilities and should play an important role. I hope today, now we have many experts here, and I saw Peggy's slides. So I hope today we will have in-depth exchanges and discussion and put forward scientific suggestions on how to eliminate vaccine hesitancy, which hopefully would provide support from the scientific community for the promotion of vaccination worldwide. In addition, I would like to take this opportunity to introduce several experts from Professor Chen Wang's team. As a member of expert panel of IAP COVID-19 advisory group, Professor Wang was also invited to attend today's webinar, but unfortunately unable to join us due to a schedule conflict. And he has entrusted Professor Lu Zaofeng, Dr. Li Bin Ma, and Dr. Ting Zhang to attend the webinar on Professor Wang's behalf. Welcome. Thank you for your great attention. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Depei. So I think I need to share my screen again. We go back to the PowerPoint. I just have a couple more things to say. Here we go. Yeah, just to reiterate, if you like, that vaccination is likely the most effective tool that we will have to emerge from the pandemic. And really, I can skip a couple of these bullet points because that's been said. But really, this webinar is designed to provide information to our member academies so that they can be sort of forearmed, if you like, as vaccination efforts get started in their countries, just to begin reacting in a preemptive way to any hesitancy issues that might arise. And we hope we can provide you with sort of the information that is required. I just have a quick couple of slides to show you where we are today. This was as of yesterday evening, so about 450 million shots have been given around the world. But you can see here that some countries, particularly North America, are doing much better, or some regions, North America is doing reasonably well. The world average is just a little over 5%. So, and I think what we really need to get that herd immunity is somewhere near a global average of 70%, equally distributed around the world. So we still really have a long way to go. Who are here with us today? This is a little pie chart based on the registrations that we received. Like I said, more than 200 registrations. I'm not sure exactly how many people we have with us sort of logged in with us today, but we can check that for you. You can see the majority of these are in the medical sciences, just a little less than 50%. We have other academy representatives, of course, sort of from other fields of science, whether that's physics, chemistry, whatever it might be. We have a small percentage of administrative staff from the different academies that we've invited from among the IAP membership, and of course their communication staff as well from academies. So we have a reasonable distribution of expertise present. And just looking at the distribution of registrations, we have a little more from Africa than the other regions of the world, but a pretty sort of even distribution. So you will have seen, while you were registering, you will have filled in a question as part of the registration form to try and allow us to understand the causes or the factors behind vaccine hesitancy in your countries. We've tried to divide these into 4 key categories of uncertainty, misinformation, disinformation, and the real conspiracy theories. And I don't want to go through all these slides, but these were sent to you, this information in a sort of package a few days ago before you joined the meeting. And we'll share this again. What you see on the slides here is slightly updated with a few late registrations. But I hope our panelists will be sort of answering some of these factors of uncertainty, factors of misinformation, and so on as we go through today's session. And then we'll hopefully answer a lot of these factors through the panelists' presentations. But obviously we're available for questions and answers as we come back at the end. So I'm going to stop here and invite the first panelist to give his presentation. So the first speaker is Toni Gabaldón. He's a research professor jointly affiliated to the Institute for Research in Biomedicine and the Barcelona Supercomputing Center, where he leads the Comparative Genomics group. In his research, he's used an evolutionary genomics approach to understand the origin and spread of emerging human pathogens. Professor Gabaldón is a member of the IAP Covid-19 expert group and an alumnus of the Spanish Young Academy. So I believe our technical guy here, Massimo, is going to share the slides. Professor Gabaldón, the microphone is yours.
Hello, so my name is Toni Gabaldón. I'm an ACREA research professor at the Barcelona Supercomputing Center and the Institute for Research in Biomedicine in Barcelona, Spain. And today I'm going to talk about the main types of vaccines that have been developed against COVID-19. So I'll start with this first slide just as a reminder of how fast things have developed regarding the development of vaccines for COVID-19. So the disease was first described in December 2019 from atypical pneumonia cases in Wuhan, China. And less than a month afterwards, the genome of the virus was deciphered, and at that moment, development of vaccines started. In March 2020, the World Health Organization declares COVID-19 pandemics as the disease was spreading worldwide. And at that moment, the first vaccine had already entered phase 1 clinical trials. In May 2020, a World Health Organization declares priority to accelerate research and development of COVID-19 vaccines. And at that moment, 11 vaccines were already in clinical testing, some processing already from phase 1 to phase 2. And vaccine development went fast, and in December 2020, we had already the first vaccines which received approval for general use, and the first vaccination campaigns started in some countries. I will also remind a bit how vaccines work. First, let's think about how the body reacts to an infection of a virus. So first is the innate immune system that responds to the virus with cells that try to eliminate those foreign viruses, but also besides fighting against the virus, these cells are also uptaking viral antigens, which are part of the viruses like surface proteins, and presenting them to the cells of the adaptive immunity system. So several of these cells will develop antibodies that are specific for the antigens of this virus, and we learned to recognize this virus and to activate different types of cells that can detect the virus and kill the virus in a subsequent infection. So the process of vaccination, basically what tries to do is to imitate this process, tries to stimulate our immune system to be able to react against a specific pathogen. And it does so by not reproducing an infection, but trying to do something that mimics the presence of the virus in our body so our immune cells can be trained to detect it. And as we will see, there are different ways in which this can be done, either by using whole viruses or by using parts of the viruses, and always in a way that doesn't cause disease, but it causes the immunization. So I also want to remind some other aspects of the vaccines that are important in terms of developing the vaccines, and also for policymakers and healthcare workers to decide what is the most appropriate vaccine or vaccination strategy. So first of all is safety. All vaccines that are approved have to be safe and sufficiently safe. This means they should not have severe secondary effect, and this is one of the objectives of most clinical trials, is to prove for the safety beyond the efficiency of the vaccine. Then vaccines, of course, should be able to induce immune protection. That is their purpose, so to generate immune protection. And another key question is how long this immune response that is generated through the vaccination may last. As you know, for some vaccines, additional boosts are needed after some time as the immunization decreases with time. Another important aspect is the degree of protection. Some vaccines will, simply attenuate infection, so making the infection less severe, but there will be an infection anyway. Some vaccines are able to stop the infection. They may avoid the viral spread, and they may reduce the viral load to such low levels that they will also reduce transmission, or they will, produce hygienization of the vaccinated person. In addition, it's important to consider the scope of protection, because vaccines are developed against a given virus, maybe a given variant of the virus, and the question is whether these will be similarly effective against different variants. such is the case for the seasonal influenza vaccine that has to be updated every year due to changes in the virus. Another important aspect of the vaccines is how we are going to administer them. Can be different ways, injection or sprays, oral, or even the number of doses. As you know, for the COVID-19 vaccines, we have vaccines that single dose vaccines or vaccines that need a second dose. And another practical aspects that are important in terms of the vaccines that make every vaccine different from each other is production cost, storage, distribution, and so on, as these are important aspects after one vaccine is approved to make it arrive to the different countries and to the persons that need them. So this is a cartoonish overview of the different types of vaccines that have been tried for COVID-19. Most of them use either some parts of the virus, and most of them use this spike protein, which is one of the proteins at the surface of the virus, the proteins that make these spikes. And I will go over the different types of vaccines that have been developed for COVID-19. Basically, all kind of approaches have been displayed in order to find a vaccine against COVID-19, and we have example of the different vaccines. This is an example of how the distribution of different approaches for vaccine developments in those vaccines that are more advanced. As you see, we have of the four main types using the whole virus, protein subunit, nucleic acids, or viral vectors. So I'll start with the live attenuated virus. This is the traditional way of developing vaccines. The idea is to use a virus, the same virus that caused the disease, but in an attenuated version, in a weakened version of the virus. To achieve so, the easiest solution is to grow the virus into a non-human cells, can be chicken cells or other type of cells, for many passages, so that the virus gets, by being reproduced in a system different from human, eventually loses the ability to infect human cells. So it is safe to put this virus, this attenuated virus, into our body without creating a severe infection. So this is somehow easy because you just need to cultivate the virus, but it can be a very lengthy development because you never know exactly when the virus is going to lose the virulence. You need to check whether the virulence is lost and so on. And it may cause a mild infection upon administration of the vaccine. And many classical vaccines, such as measles, mumps, and rubella, are developed in this way. And for COVID-19, we have a Gjoneska case that is using this approach. Another approach that uses a whole virus is inactivated virus. In this way, you take the virus and you directly inactivate it using heat or chemical treatments. So this is much faster than growing them in a different cellular system. However, the level of immunization achieved is just generally lower, and you usually require the use of adjuvants, which are molecules that are added together with these inactivated viruses in the vaccines to enhance the immunization. And examples of these vaccines is some types of the polio vaccine. And for COVID-19, we have the Sinopharm or Sinovac as examples of vaccines that use this approach. Another approach is the use of safe vectors, which are generally different viruses from the one that you want to target, that express some parts of the target virus. So these vectors are generally viruses that do not infect humans and that have been engineered, so they are safe and can be easily manipulated, and they are engineered to present parts, for instance, to encode a surface protein and have in their surface a protein from a different virus, which is generally the virus you want to target and the virus that you want your immune system to develop antibodies against. An example of this is some types of the Ebola vaccine. And for COVID-19, we have the examples are the ones developed by AstraZeneca and University of Oxford, the Sputnik vaccine developed by Gamaleya Research Institute, CanSino Biologicals, and the one of Johnson & Johnson. Another approach is not to use whole viruses or whole viral systems, but just to input in our body specific parts of the virus, and usually these mean proteins of the virus that for which we want to develop the antibody. In this way, you specifically direct your immune system towards a specific target. And most for COVID-19, most of the proteins used are the spike surface protein of COVID-19, and the idea is to administer these proteins into our body and let the immune system recognize them as antigens and generate the antibodies. Usually you can add the proteins together with coadjuvants or sometimes as part of nanoparticles or viral-like particles that are ways to deliver these proteins. And examples are the seasonal influenza vaccine, and for COVID-19, the Novavax and Epivac Corona vaccines. Then we come to the most recently developed type of vaccines, which are the ones that use DNA or RNA fragments that code for viral proteins to elicit an immune response. So first, let's start with the DNA vaccines. So DNA vaccines, they use synthetic DNAs, usually in the form of a plasmid, that are circular, double-stranded DNA that have the information to synthesize viral components, for instance, the surface protein. This DNA have to reach our cells and be interpreted by our cells that synthesize these components. So one complication for these vaccines is that the DNA needs to enter into the cells, and in this specific case, into the nucleus as well, so that the genes can be interpreted, transcribed, and translated, so that these proteins are expressed. And so you need to have delivery systems such as lipid nanoparticles, or some of these vaccines are delivered through electroporation. So there are no approved vaccine for human use yet, but there has been some with veterinary applications which have had promising results. And for COVID-19 vaccines, we have one case in Inovio, developed by Inovio, that is now in phase 3 as an example. The RNA vaccines are similar to the DNA vaccines, but are one step closer to the proteins, because the DNA is transcribed into RNA and the RNA is translated into protein. So the RNA already carries the message to be translated into the protein. And similarly to the DNA vaccines, they need to enter the cells. In this case, they can stay in the cytoplasm, where the RNA will be interpreted by our ribosomes and translate the target protein, so that the protein will appear in our cells and will be recognized by our immune system. One problem with these vaccines is that this RNA is unstable, so generally these vaccines usually need to be preserved at low temperatures. And the first approved examples are the ones used for COVID. For COVID-19, we have several examples that have been already approved, like the one of Moderna, Pfizer, BioNTech, and CureVac. So general, why these vaccines are so popular now, and so they are being developed for different viruses apart from the coronavirus, and also for other types of pathogens. One of the advantages of these vaccines is that you don't need to culture the virus. You can design a vaccine with the genome sequence information solely and synthesize those molecules. It's easily recoded for new variants and viruses, so there is a potential for multivalency, because you can input different messenger RNAs for different viruses, for instance. It has a rapid development and production, and generally you need a low dosage, because from one copy of RNA or DNA you can synthesize thousands of proteins, so you can really input at much lower dosage. The disadvantages generally are the low stability, storage distribution constraints. That's, for instance, we need to have them in low temperatures, which may complicate its distribution around the world. And so far, they are more expensive than the other vaccines, but this may change in the near future if the use of these vaccines are being more popularized. And with this, I'd like to finish. I'd like to thank you. And these are some sources and useful links that I used to develop this talk, and also to where I took some of the graphics that I was showing. And with this, I'll finish and thank you. And I'll be happy to answer your questions. Thanks.
I don't see any questions in the Q&A. A reminder to our participants that if you have any questions for Professor Gabaldón, we will come back to him in the moderated panel discussion later on. So I think at this point, because of time constraints, we can move on directly to Margaret Hamburg. Peggy is a doctor, a medical doctor, and she's current co-chair of IAP Health and the vice president of the Global Biological Programs and Policy of the Nuclear Threat Initiative. Following her medical training, Dr. Hamburg worked at the National Institutes of Health doing research and policy as the assistant director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. And she also spent time as the commissioner of New York City Department of Health. More importantly, for today's webinar, she spent about 6 years, 2009 to 2015, as commissioner of the US Food and Drug Administration. So Peggy, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. And I'll try to go through my discussion fairly quickly so that we can have time for broader discussion at the end with the distinguished panel. But I do think it's very important to take a little time to talk about the regulatory oversight of the vaccine research and development process and approvals. When we're addressing the issues of vaccine hesitancy, we all need to recognize that trust and confidence in the vaccines, in their safety and efficacy and quality, and that they were developed in a way that followed rigorous standards and procedures is very, very important to the ultimate uptake of the vaccine by people all around the world. So I'm very pleased to be able to address really the regulatory role in the vaccine development process. Next slide, please. We just heard a wonderful overview of all the different types of vaccines that are in development, and many are now authorized for use by different countries' national regulatory authorities, and are going into people's arms in countries around the globe. Every country has a different legal regulatory framework, but regulatory authorities everywhere really follow some very common approaches. And it's important to understand that the regulatory oversight is not just yes, no, approval, not approval, but it really is a life cycle approach, starting very early, working with researchers and companies around strain selection and reference standard production, the preclinical and animal study issues, the clinical trial design, of course, the evaluation of safety and efficacy after the data comes in. Importantly, also the manufacturing processes are under the purview of regulatory authorities, including the manufacturing site inspections, quality control, and lot release. Then there's also a hugely important component, which is the post-market surveillance, as we say. What that means is that once the vaccines or other medical products go into use, the continued monitoring for the emergence of possible safety concerns, for better understanding of efficacy in the real world, and whether there need to be changes in the indications for use or the strategies for use. Another important component is really working with the scientific research community to advance vaccine technologies. We just learned about all the different types of vaccines that can be used and are in development. One important aspect now is we're looking at the threat of variants, as I'm sure you're all aware. Being able to rapidly adapt existing vaccines to modify them to address a new vaccine variant without going through all of the studies. So being able to help establish the validity for use of a vaccine platform where you can sort of plug and play as new variants emerge is a critical activity now for regulators in the context of COVID. And finally, regulatory authorities have a very important role in providing information to the public and to healthcare providers about the products, their appropriate use, and that is a critical component as we talk about public confidence in vaccines and reducing vaccine hesitancy. Next slide, please. So this is a little bit of a complicated graphic, but put up to show the sort of normal strategy for vaccine development at the top, and then how it's been modified in response to COVID-19. Normally vaccine development is a very careful stepwise process where you begin with preclinical data collection, you study the possible strategies, you go into phase 1 with healthy adults generally, but healthy people to look at safety and dosing issues. And then you begin to extend your trial size to learn more about safety and really the assessment of efficacy. And the phase 3 is really the critical pivotal trial, which is very much larger and controlled, looking at vaccine against placebo in most cases. And then you move to the assessment of safety and efficacy and approval. Generally, each step is done, the data assessed, the company makes a decision about the probability of success down the line, and do they want to continue to invest? Do they continue to want to move the product forward? The average historically for vaccine development has been 10 to 12 years. The fastest before COVID was 4 years for months. So the ability to go from the initial posting of the genome in January 2020 by Chinese scientists and authorized vaccine going into people's arms in less than a year is truly extraordinary. And that was possible because decisions were made with the regulatory authorities, working closely with scientists in academia and in the companies developing these products to look at how one could consolidate and compress the different phases of study. That meant moving much more swiftly, but it did not mean abandoning scientific standards and rigor, and that's very important to convey. In addition, many companies working often with government made the decision to invest in large scale up and manufacturing early on before it was clear whether the vaccines would actually make it over the finish line for authorization for use. It was a financial risk, but that risk has paid off as we've seen vaccines now, once approved by regulatory authorities, moving very, very quickly in the marketplace, much more quickly than would normally occur. So I think that while there was uncertainty about this revised pandemic speed model, and in the United States, the term Operation Warp Speed for these efforts did not help for those who were vaccine hesitant to have confidence that these vaccines were developed in a rigorous scientific way. But in fact, the data was reviewed by independent scientists and advisory board, the Data Safety Monitoring Board, and then an advisory board. And the ability to move swiftly has really made a difference. Next slide, please. So I've mentioned about authorization. Authorization is different than full approval, which is the standard approach. Almost every country has a legal regulatory mechanism for emergency use authorization. They differ in various ways, but the point is an ability in a public health emergency to be able to move more swiftly, to not have to follow all of the administrative processes and paperwork that can be time consuming, but also to be able to authorize use under certain carefully prescribed conditions. You have to, in the case of the COVID vaccine development, there was a commitment to doing the large, well-designed phase 3 clinical studies so that we could get clear and compelling data as to efficacy, and also a duration of trial that would enable collection of safety information, both in the near term where most safety issues emerge, but also a bit more prolonged period. For an emergency use authorization, you have to really be able to show that the recognized benefits outweigh known risks. In addition, in large part because of the concerns about public trust and confidence in these vaccines, there was a determination in the United States, and others have used this as well, of having an open, transparent public advisory committee meeting where the data was discussed between the regulatory authority scientists, the company scientists, and an independent outside panel of vaccine and virology experts to assess the benefits and risks. And for emergency use authorization, there has to be a very clear post-deployment of the vaccine surveillance strategy to continue studies and to continue to collect information about safety and efficacy. Next slide, please. A couple of key issues. We've already talked about the phases of the clinical trials, but for COVID-19 vaccines, it was very important that the phase 3 studies contain the very populations most at risk, most in need of getting vaccinated. And that included those with other medical comorbidities, elderly individuals who sometimes are excluded from clinical trials, but here it was very, very important to make sure that they were included because we know that elderly people often don't mount as robust immune responses, and we wanted to know the impact in that particular subpopulation, very importantly. Also, racial and ethnic minorities who have been disproportionately burdened by COVID-19. Also, women of childbearing potential were included in the studies, some pregnant women. However, children were not included, and the pediatric studies are now underway for many of the vaccines, and that will continue importantly so that we ultimately can have the vaccination safety net for all. Next slide, please. I think it's important to recognize that in the case of COVID-19 and for other vaccine clinical trials as well, we are thinking in much more innovative and adaptive ways, and that is important for accelerating the process while adhering to rigorous scientific standards. One challenge during the research and development process for COVID-19 vaccines is that we still don't know the correlates of immune protection, what aspects of the body's immune response actually protect you from infection, from serious disease. And that, of course, is key. Because the correlates of protection weren't known going in for the vaccine trials, the endpoints were, very concrete SARS-CoV-2 infection or disease. Most of the studies really focused on serious disease, hospitalization, and death. It is crucial that we continue to fully define the correlates of immune protection so that we can speed new vaccine R&D and to enable future studies. These studies are going to be harder to do going forward with multiple vaccines now available for use. It's going to be harder to do placebo-controlled studies. That's certainly the case. Correlates of immune protection could help us. some are thinking about or even undertaking human vaccine challenge studies. We need to continue to develop new vaccines. We need to continue to better understand the existing vaccines. Important dimensions were touched on by the previous speaker, but including duration of protection. Well, we need to have multiple boosts over time. And also, we still don't know everything that we need to know about prevention of asymptomatic infection and potential spread. Next slide, please. And in this international meeting context, I did want to underscore the importance of the collaboration amongst regulatory authorities around the world. During COVID-19, there was really an unprecedented coordination and collaboration amongst regulatory authorities to expedite and streamline the development, authorization, and availability of COVID-19 treatments and vaccines, really aligning the work of different regulatory authorities along many dimensions that enabled more data sharing, more comparing of data collected, and for companies, the ability to be sure that they wouldn't be asked by different regulatory authorities to do different studies, to collect different information, and the ability to have common dossier requirements, both from a scientific and administrative perspective, both enhanced the process and accelerated the process. And the International Coalition of Medicine Regulatory Authorities, ICMRA, really served as an important forum to support the strategic coordination and international cooperation, and I think will be an important aspect of international regulatory work going forward. So with that, I'll stop, and I look forward to questions and further discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Peggy. I don't see any direct questions for you from what you've been saying, but I think that was a very good explanation of the processes that have been followed and strictly followed before these vaccines are being rolled out publicly. There has been a question on sharing the slides, and they will be available on the IAP website also as videos sort of in the next sort of week or so. We'll see how soon we can get them on. I propose at this point we pass on directly to Biljana, and we'll take the break after Biljana has spoken. So Biljana Gjoneska holds a medical degree and a doctoral degree in psychology and neuroscience. She's a research associate at the Macedonian Academy of Sciences and Arts. Her research on topics related to neuropolitics and neuroethics, brings together fields ranging from social psychology to cognitive neuroscience. And she's been involved in Europe-wide projects on conspiracy theories and problematic usage of the internet, amongst others. So you can see we're moving away from the science and the regulatory system to really how people think here. She is also a representative on the steering committee of the IAP Young Physician Leaders Program. So Biljana, the screen and the microphone are yours. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Peter. I hope all of you can hear me well, and I really thank you for inviting me. I'm really happy to be surrounded by medical officials, being a medical doctor myself. Maybe they are not the best experts in solving IT issues, but they are very, very relevant for this topic. And I'm really also happy that these medical experts today are not dressed in white coats. And I'm saying this not only to refer to your health status, because I hope that all of you are enjoying this webinar. I'm mentioning this in reference to my presentation, namely halfway through my preparation for this presentation yesterday, I realized that there are so many medical terms that are circulating nowadays, the public discourse and media landscape. We are using terms as Zoom fatigue, doom scrolling, and today in my presentation, you will also hear terms like information disorder, infodemic, a healthy media lifestyle, psychological inoculation, truth sandwich, and such. This medicalization, I mean, it's kind of intentional. It goes along with the pandemic, even Oxford Dictionary had stated that there was unsurmountable, unprecedented seismic shift in the language production data. These terms are kind of illustrative, very vivid, bring associations to mind very quickly. So be mindful of them. I will explain them along the way as we go along this presentation, which Peter very nicely summarized, that is going to be oriented towards covering behavioral and social psychological aspects of vaccine hesitancy. So let's roll. The first slide is kind of busy, sorry for that. It's taken from a study, very highly referenced study on vaccine hesitancy that was published in 2013 when the pandemic was not the issue. But this conceptual model kind of tried to tackle historic, political, and socio-cultural context of vaccine hesitancy. The slide itself is busy because the topic is kind of complex, as all of the previous speakers already mentioned. It's multifactorial in essence. But this multifactorial etiology can be roughly divided into two types, two groups of factors, those related to the individual and those related to the society, which affect the decision-making process that, as many have said, in vaccine hesitancy is kind of prolonged. And it's kind of halfway in between complete acceptance and complete resistance towards vaccination. So the individual factors are related to the knowledge base, the knowledge gaps, the information an individual has is related to this topic. Past experiences, favorable, unfavorable, perceived importance of the topic, but also perceived risk, which is a very important issue nowadays with this very dynamic process of knowledge generation, which is evolving very fast, as the preceding speaker, Professor Margaret, has already emphasized. The normalizing of this tendency for vaccination, for acceptance of vaccination, accepting it as a subjective norm, but also religious and moral convictions of the individual. As regards the society, I will only briefly mention that both communication and media landscape nowadays, not the ecosystem, which is not traditional anymore, it's relying more and more on social media, the health professionals and public health officials, all three groups of people are very important in vaccine-related attitudes of general public. But as I say, this is produced in 2013. What happens nowadays? I think that this model deserves to be revised nowadays in the face of this current pandemic. And I will explain all of these different factors, mostly related to the society as we go along. So let's start with the public health and identity politics. Why I mention identity politics? Because we were kind of, I will explain all the references, but first I will just provide a brief background. We were kind of witnessing in this past year that most of the communication, especially science-related communications, was going via different channels. The main authorities were in the health domain were aligning themselves with the political authorities. And nowadays we have a tendency for, I should say, polarization of the society, because political identity serves as a proxy of all those different kinds of identities, racial, ethnic, you name it. There are many, as an umbrella term for different types of groupings of people. So for example, if one is right-wing oriented, the rest can kind of infer all the other intergroupal aspects of this individual. So as I say, political identity is in function of social identity, which infers to the identity of a person as being shaped by his belonging to a certain group, in this case, political group. And when this political identity has such a big importance, then the political leader himself or herself is in fact the authority also on issues which are not very closely related to the topic of the pandemic. And this was in a way evidenced in a certain publication, which is under revision, in which I participated. And it's a multinational study involving 67 countries and around 50,000 participants from all over the world. And we found the main finding was that people who identify more strongly with their nation are those that are more willing to adhere to public health policies. Now, we were investigating back then in March and April in 2020, the willingness to have spatial distancing, to respect the physical hygiene and other public health measures. But I suppose this should be also extended to cover the vaccine-related attitudes of people. And in this regard, leaders that can, in a way, invoke this feeling of belongingness to a nation should be those that could be successful in conveying the message about the importance of vaccines. So one very shining example is the Prime Minister of New Zealand. She was referring to the nation as the nation of 5 million, a team of 5 million people, in order to kind of invoke this in-group belongingness. And we all know that the strategy was successful in preventing the spread of the virus. As regards the health science officials and medical authorities, nowadays we are also witnessing the science-related, so-called science-related populism. And as any type of populism, essentially it is based, its premise is on antagonism, on clash, on struggle between the elites, in this case, academic medical elites, but also on the other hand, there are people, ordinary people, and people are presented as virtues, as victims, or as martyrs, whereas the academic elites, including also medical academies of sciences, is corrupted morally or intellectually. And this is because usually the perception is that elites are the ones that hold sovereignty, the supreme authority over the decision-making process. They are the ones that are making decisions who is going to perform a research, when and where. They are setting the agendas, allocating funds, etc. And they are also claiming authority over the valid information. But it is perceived in the science-related populism as this is done in non-cooperative way. So in a way, behind closed doors without participation of the public. And maybe this is one of the reasons why people are kind of distrustful of medical authorities, or maybe more prone to vaccine hesitant, adopt vaccine hesitant attitudes. In relation to this, I will point you to some very important publications that were brilliant pieces, think pieces issued by my panel working group on improving scientific input, and also a short booklet for global young physicians. So they will provide more insights on this topic. And we are arriving at the last important factor, which, as we know today, is kind of polluted. And this is where the information disorder comes at play. Disorder usually is used in order to signify disorganized, dysregulated, disbalanced, imbalanced presentation of information and spread of information, usually aligned along 3 categories: misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. And I know that the next speaker is going to provide much better overview on this topic. I'm just going to mention that this categorization is kind of arbitrary, but it's very illustrative. So in case of the misinformation, the content is false. Those are inaccurate or combination of fiction and facts stories. In the case of malinformation, the content may not be inaccurate, but it's certainly damaging. So it's infringing some privacy issues related to the target individual and or groups of people. Whereas at the intersection of those two is disinformation, and those are usually stories that combine facts and fictions, but are coined with certain agenda. So there is a specific malevolent intention, but also a false content. And usually they are called fake news, even though the term nowadays is abandoned, because not all information is newsworthy. Not all information is totally fake, and usually fake news is used as a label nowadays to attack the opponent. Conspiracy theories are very important, circulating nowadays at a bigger proportion. Even Oxford English Dictionary said that the use of this term has doubled since 2019. So, I mean, this is a telling sign that something that the uncertainty in the society is growing, which is kind of very natural, and I will explain now why. So there are several psychological factors as to the tendency to trust in conspiracy theories, which may also be related to vaccine hesitancy. They are also categorized, as you can see. I very much like categorizing, or using studies that use different conceptual models. And this is a very important study by a very relevant authority in the field, Professor Karen Douglas from the University of Kent. And she categorizes those factors along 3 lines: existential factors that are related to the feelings of safety in one's environment, feelings of being in control in the environment. Of course, in the situation with the pandemic, with the growing number of cases and mortality and morbidity rates, at least at the beginning of the pandemic, this sense is shattered in a way. So it's understandable that people who are susceptible to believe in conspiracy theories, that they will turn to some explanation that will return the sense of safety in the environment. Then epistemic motives, feeling of understanding of one's environment, and conspiracy theories are kind of a simplistic explanations of very complex happenings. They offer, in a way, anthropocentric version of reality, in which people are the ones that are responsible driving the events. And they can, if we target the right individuals, then we will be able to solve the problem. And usually at the core of conspiracy theories, and that there are some individuals or groups that are malevolent and they are scheming, plotting against the society. In the case of vaccines, usually those are pharma industries, medical professionals, all those people that are involved in the production of the vaccine. And as the third factor, those are social factors, and usually tendency to perceive, to maintain a positive image of oneself, not to perceive oneself as a loser, let's say, as the one who is not in control of the happenings. This is also a kind of important factor in tackling the tendency to trust in conspiracy theories, but probably also vaccine hesitancy. As regards another set of factors that are more related to the individual, especially personality traits, cognitive styles, and worldviews of people that are prone to believe in conspiracy theories, but also maybe they are prone to be more trustful in conspiratorial narratives, and at the same time more distrustful in the official narratives regarding the vaccines. I will only say that there are some inconclusive findings regarding the personality traits, but pretty much there is a scientific consensus as regards the link with the neuroticism, narcissism, and openness to new experience, which is kind of non-conventional, eccentric, too open regard on alternative ways of dealing with scientifically important subjects as vaccines. Cognitive styles are very, very much important, and there is established knowledge by now that the intuitive thinking style is related with the tendency to trust in conspiracy theories. Intuitive means gutsy feeling, reflexive reasoning, the one which is not premeditated. It's concerned with the big picture, but not with the details, is not effortful, it's not slow. And usually this intuitive thinking style is associated with many cognitive biases. We are all prone to different types of cognitive biases, but we are more prone to experience them as a way to explain the world and our surroundings when we are prone to think automatically and fast and rapidly. And societal worldview, it's kind of Manichaean worldview where there is only black or white, and the elites are corrupted, as I said, the individuals are virtuous, and this generates distrust, as I say, in official authorities. So what can we do about it? How can we tackle vaccine hesitant individuals? But most importantly, how can we communicate important messages related to vaccines? There are important pieces now produced by Professor Sander van der Linden, and he is kind of, again, reintroducing the term called psychological inoculation. The reference to vaccine inoculation, it's pretty much straightforward. He thinks, and I mean, it's an older theory, but he is, as I mentioned, reintroducing it because he thinks that exposure to relevant information will desensitize the individual towards disinformation. So we know that 100 times repeated lie become a truth, and the way to tackle it is by repeating the truth equal number of times. But also in the inoculation, we are kind of sending a forward warning that maybe some of the news people are reading on social media can be construed in a false way and can be not entirely trustful. So we are kind of setting their expectations before they are faced with the information usually on social media. So this has proved to be an effective strategy in communicating issues about vaccines, especially in tackling misinformation. And then another important strategy is prioritization. It's a kind of a triage, but from a psychological related point. This is a strategy in which we kind of make a decision, conscious decisions on which issues are important to be tackled. Not all scientific issues are equally important, and some of them, if they are tackled, they can be reinforced, disseminated more quickly among individuals. But certainly the issue of vaccines and probably climate related issues, those that are related to science denial, are very important, and they should be given a priority. Truth sandwich is also an approach usually kind of suggested to journalists and it's kind of, it relates to layering the truth in a way that first you address the truthful fact, then you mention the inaccurate information that was presented in the media, and then you again restate the truthful fact, reinforce it in order just to make sure that the right message is conveyed and that the untruthful message was tackled and addressed. There are also some more visually oriented strategies, and you can find them they are very nicely aligned in the COVID-19 vaccine communication handbook by Professor Lewandowski. But here I will just reiterate that when you are taking some way to address, to improve communication and fight misinformation, you should start by choosing your battles. Not every piece of information deserves to be tackled, and not every individual is the right person to not persuade, but to discuss with on this issue. And I think that in the group of people who are vaccine hesitant are maybe the right group, because as I said, they are in midway between accepting and refusing the vaccine. So maybe they can be, as I said, the idea is not to persuade them, but they can be made more aware. You can increase their awareness about the importance of the issues. It's usually best to go private so as to avoid those issues of moral grandstanding, moral outrage that are very frequently dominant on social media. and to practice active listening approach, to align oneself with the other person, to recognize common ground, parts of the topic that are common ground to both of you, because as I said, usually those false informations are combined with truthful informations. So once you find that common ground, you should kind of start by presenting your truth, but not in a manner that is kind of aggressive, but you should kind of make it clear that you are not a representative of big pharma or of anyone's interest. You are very much interested in presenting the objective truth, and then proceed to tailor the message according to the needs and interests and beliefs of the people you are addressing. Explain, if needed, how internet works. When you are helping them to understand the statistical information, you should be very much not kind of overloading with them with information. Be unapologetically uncertain, so state the uncertainties regarding something, but also very much state what is known and what is already established as objective truth. And as I say, always practice inoculation. So this would be a very short overview on a very complex issue. And as you can see, I have been busy working on this issue, especially within the framework of the European Cost Project on conspiracy theories. And I would like to thank colleagues from this project, also from the project that is also multinational, tackling conspiracy theories, also related to vaccine hesitancy, but special to the presidency of the Inter-Academic Panel, our hosts today, and the Secretariat, who were fantastic, always providing logistics at any time of day and night, and my colleague at the Alumni Steering Committee of the Young Physician Leaders, especially Juan Carlos Nunes, who was presenting with me on this issue, on this topic earlier in June. This is when Peter invited me to present. Thank you very, very much, and looking forward to your questions. Bye.
Okay, thank you, Biljana. And I think there is one question there that is very interesting for you. I don't know if you can see it, but I think we have to go into just a shorter 5-minute break, just to allow people to stand up and walk around, rest their eyes a little bit. Let us go into the break and be back at 20 to the hour, whatever your hour is, 20 to the hour.
Yeah, I will make sure to go over through the questions. Sorry, Peter, to interrupt, and we try to address them later on. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Okay, welcome back, everybody. Hope you managed to have a good few minutes break there. Let us move on with our next presentation, sort of real final key speaker for this afternoon, this morning, if you're in a different time zone, perhaps. We're going to move now to Herman Wasserman. He's a professor of media studies at the University of Cape Town in South Africa and a senior research associate at the Center for Analytics and Behavioral Change. He's a fellow of the International Communication Association and an elected member of the Academy of Science of South Africa. He has published and presented research on misinformation widely, including the World Health Organization's first conference on the COVID-19 infodemic. And something to watch out for, he has co-edited a collection called Rumors, False News and Disinformation in the Global South, which will be published later this year by Wiley Blackwell. So something to watch out for from Professor Wasserman. And if you're there, Herman, please go ahead, share your screen, and we can get onto your presentation.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, all good. Thank you.
Okay, let me start then, and I'm presuming you can see my screen, right?
Yes, very good.
Okay. Thanks very much for this invitation, and thank you very much to the previous speakers. Really interesting discussion so far. I think my presentation will largely overlap in some respects with Dr. Gjoneska's presentation that she just presented. I will focus a bit more, I think, on some of the contextual aspects around misinformation, maybe less on the psychological aspects. And I will specifically maybe highlight some of the issues from the Global South, and specifically from Africa, where most of my research has been focused on. So I'll speak a little bit about how we define mis and disinformation, or though Dr. Gjoneska has already done that largely. And then I'll focus a bit on why and how does misinformation spread, because I think that is important when we speak about context, is to understand how contexts influence the spread of mis and disinformation. And that's also most of my work is focused on that. And then maybe suggest ideas around how can we counter it. So we've already heard the UNESCO's definitions on disinformation, misinformation, and malinformation, and I agree with the previous speaker that this is, you know, there's a bleeding between these categories. They're not, you know, fixed, and a lot of this has to do with intent. So it's also not always possible to ascertain what somebody's intent would be. Interestingly, also that some of our research has shown that you know, when people's understanding or intent might change. So they might share something unknowingly, which would make it sort of misinformation, but then sometimes they do so knowingly, although you know they might not intend harm. So there's a bit of a conceptual vagueness there, but I think it is useful, and I'll try and also show some examples of you know, of different types of information. I think why it's important is that that we realize that disinformation, misinformation, let's say false information as an overarching category takes different forms and is linked to people's motivations and context. And then secondly, I think what's also useful here is the concept of the infodemic that the WHO has spent some time on previous year especially. Again here, you know, we run up against maybe the limitations of metaphors when we speak about information and the fight against disinformation as, you know, as inoculation and so on. But I think what is useful and important here is the overabundance of information and the fact that people are often confused and anxious. And given the current context where information and guidance also shifts as the pandemic and as the science around it evolves, that infodemic notion of an infodemic, I think, is useful in trying to understand why, especially why people consume and why people share this type of information. So some of the examples, again, here from the African and South African context, largely, I think what we've seen now is that the conspiracy theories and disinformation around vaccinations are mapping onto, are being amplified by already circulating disinformation. So there's already been a vast amount of disinformation on COVID-19, on the origins of the virus, of its nature, of its severity, etc. And now the vaccine issue maps onto that, and you know, that creates the potential for what has been called a superstorm, an anti-vaccination superstorm, where all this misinformation sort of is amplified. We've seen some issues around misinformation, for instance, and here I'm returning to those categories that we've spoken about previously. A lot of the misinformation, I would argue, has to do with also the media ecology, the space in which people consume and share misinformation. In other words, the social media platforms that are often designed to encourage quick scrolling, encourage and incentivize, for instance, the sharing of that information. And so the spread of that false information does not always occur willingly, and is not always shared with a malicious intent, but it happens also as a result of the nature of these platforms and the nature of the interaction between people and these platforms. So the nature of those platforms and the nature of that interaction will lead to inaccurate readings, inaccurate information being spread. And then, of course, there is the more active disinformation. You know, just some examples there, some of which have occurred in the South African and African context, I think why this is important to note some of these examples is to try and understand also what they tap into. So they do tap into people's individual psychologies, as the previous speaker has already mentioned, but they also tap into a certain history and a certain social and political context. And this is, I think, especially noticeable on the African continent, where, for instance, people have already a deep mistrust maybe of big pharma, of also in many regards of information that is shared by governments. And so there's a long history of that distrust. So I think this is where disinformation finds an easy foothold. And then malinformation, again, this sometimes, as Dr. Gjoneska has referred to, is sometimes hate speech, and we can define hate speech as such, but sometimes it's also just incomplete or poorly informed journalistic reporting that can result in a type of malinformation, where there's some accurate information, but it's not contextualized properly, or the context is explained insufficiently. So again, when we see, for instance, reporting about the pause in vaccine trials, it can be framed in a way that there's this crisis about a specific vaccine, say AstraZeneca last week, or it can be framed in the sense that this is exactly why the science works, because there are pauses, there's a constant reflection, there's a scientific process, and I think when that process is not understood, or when that process is not explained properly, then we see malinformation taking root. And then lastly, I think when this type of misinformation is amplified by people in power, it becomes especially damaging. And we've seen, again, in the African context, in my own country and in Tanzania recently, where people in power have actively amplified this type of information. And that is particularly worrying and particularly problematic. And that power is not always political power. It is sometimes power that's located in people's position in a society, in a faith community, in other forms of social networks that imbue them with the sort of power that enables them to amplify this and make it more damaging. So again, I think that's where context comes into play. So, and here maybe a little bit more about the spread of misinformation and disinformation. I think it is important for us to try and understand why people consume and share misinformation if we want to really tailor our responses to specific context and specific uses and sharing practices. And I've already mentioned, that disinformation in this context often feeds on the anxieties of people, but also feeds on stereotypes of the other. We've seen, for instance, misinformation around China, particularly influential in the African context in recent times, and that again maps onto pre-existing biases, pre-existing stereotypes. The lack of trust in the media, which is a global problem, and again in the global south, particularly as a result of the history of, for instance, state-owned media, state-controlled media. So the lack of trust in the media as a global problem, but that takes different inflections in different regions, is also important, because people are then more likely to trust information that they obtain through other means than from the trusted media. So while it is important to make sure that there's enough good information out there, and that misinformation is countered by good journalism, there is the problem of trust, which also needs to be addressed, because if people don't trust the media or trust authoritative information, you have to try and get at them in a different way. So for that reason, some of research that I've been involved with has focused a lot on the motivations within contexts and within social and political and historical contexts. This also, I think, links onto the guidance that the World Health Organization has already issued, and the previous speaker also alluded to. I think the social media listening, this active listening, is really important to try and understand why people believe rumors, why they believe in conspiracy theories, sort of meet them where they are in a way, and rather than try and inject them. And I think this is where that limitation sometimes of the inoculation is maybe evident, where we can't hope to inject them with information if we don't understand exactly why they respond in a specific way. So because perceptions and motivations are really important. And we know that in particular parts of the world, the acceptance rates of vaccines are very low. And again, in my own country, in my own continent, this is a big problem. And again, related to some of the social, political, and economic histories of this place. So maybe to just give you a quick snapshot of some of the motivations and how they are manifested in the specific context. So some of the research that we've done, for instance, show that in Africa, there's a very high likelihood that people will share misinformation that they receive, even knowingly. And you know, they will do that for various reasons. And two of the main reasons are that they would do it out of a sort of misplaced sense of civic duty. So there's the idea that we have to warn others, that, you know, we will share something just in case it might be true. And often then, of course, that creates more problems than even than before. Humor and satire plays an important role. So that's why people will also share information just for fun, just for laughs. And here, the social and cultural history of communication networks in Africa, for instance, and other places in the global south are really important, because the political use of humor has a long history, where people did use humor and satire to undermine authoritative accounts from government, for instance, grand narratives, used it to undermine political power. And now, I think when we see misinformation circulating, often that role of humor plays that same role. So we have to think about ways in which to acknowledge that this is a social and historical tendency for people to communicate in this way, and then try and fit our responses and our interventions to align with those practices and those histories. So how can we counter it? I think I'm quoting here from probably the same report that the previous speaker spoke about, but there are different types of responses. And these can be categorized in terms of identification. So fact-checking, identifying issues, investigating where they come from, checking them, and then debunking them. There's another type of response. And here I'm thinking about what we can do about as academies, maybe in terms of lobbying, for instance, the production and distribution environment. And this is where legislation and counter disinformation campaigns are important, policy interventions. We have seen already in some places in the world, again, including on the African continent, the criminalization of the spread of misinformation. That, in my view, is problematic because it often becomes a smokescreen for repression of freedom of information, repression of criticism, and so on. But this is a typical response aimed at the production and distribution environment. And then there are responses that are aimed at the production and distribution mechanisms. These can be curatorial, algorithmic, the responses by the platforms themselves, for instance, to stop certain searches or to tag inaccurate claims, as we've seen on Twitter, for instance, also around the recent US elections. And that's a typical mechanism that the platform itself can apply. And then lastly, a response aimed at the target audience rather than the denier themselves. And here, typically, we're thinking about media literacy campaigns, types of educational empowerment responses, and this could be the sort of technique rebuttal that identifies the common techniques of people spreading disinformation, or it can be a topic rebuttal, which can be a way of attacking the plausibility of the disinformation with facts. In other words, the first one says, well, this is typically how disinformation works. Look, this is how the person spread this, and this is why it appealed to you. And the second approach is the topic rebuttal, where you say, well, these facts are incorrect, and these are the correct facts. So you just rebut it with proper information. So I think for me, what I would try and emphasize is that we have to establish the motivations and the causes and the perceptions of people, and that any interventions have to build on that understanding, has to build on a contextual and social, cultural, and historical understanding of the context within which it spreads. And how do we do this? Previous speakers already alluded to this. You can do surveys, social media listening, qualitative work, social media network analysis. I think all these sort of different angles of attack to establish the motivations and the causes and the perceptions. And then, once you've established what the dominant motivations are in a specific context, then you could design, the responses to align with those motivations. So, for instance, if you say that in a specific context, such as Africa, the notion of civic responsibility is a main driver of the sharing of misinformation, then you might have to enlist people to help spread correct information. You have to speak to and try and identify who the main influences are, the main sources of authority. If a dominant motivation might be fun or sharing something just for laughs and humor, then develop memes and gamify maybe some of these responses in order to gain people's interaction. I know the WHO has, for instance, already worked with emojis, for instance, and it might be a very small start, but it is one way of trying to tap into the same discourse and use the same discursive elements that this information uses. I think importantly, a top-down, one-directional communication has its limits, especially when people are skeptical of authority, especially when there's already a deep-seated distrust of the media or of official sources of information. And as far as one could, especially within the social distancing context, we have to try and create spaces where there's enough dialogue and discussion and questions and answers with people. Instead of driving misinformation underground, or instead of amplifying the polarization that is already happening. We know we hear a lot about echo chambers and filter bubbles. We've seen this play out in politics, and often by shaming people publicly or by making fun of them, you just drive them further into those polarizations. I think that's why it's important to create spaces where people can feel safe to share. I've heard this conspiracy theory here, and you take it seriously and you listen to them and you engage with them. So engagement of civil society, faith communities, family networks, all of these things I think are important. It's also important, I think, in contexts in the global south, because that upholds the freedom of expression. Because you don't want to create a further problem by clamping down on misinformation through criminalizing it, for instance, and thereby amplifying another problem that is already existing in these contexts, namely repression of freedom of speech. So yes, counter bad information with good information, but also think about issues of trust, access, and what the most efficient modes of delivery are within these contexts. With that, I think I'll stop so that we still have time for questions and answers. But thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Herman. So especially appreciated your second last slide there with a few practical tips, if you like, of how academies can maybe begin to respond in their countries. So at this point, we have an hour left in this webinar. So I would like to bring in Professor Gagandeep Kang. She is going to sort of moderate a final discussion. We have been taking note of all your questions, and we're trying to systematize them and sort of target them at different speakers. But let me first introduce Gagandeep Kang. She's a physician scientist who's built a strong interdisciplinary research program that combines careful and detailed field epidemiology with molecular tools for characterizing infectious agents and host responses to infection. So she's conducted clinical trials, phase 1 to phase 4 trials of vaccines, particularly for rotavirus, and developed multi-site surveillance programs across India and Southeast Asia. She's currently professor at the Wellcome Trust Research Laboratory in the Christian Medical College in Vellore, India, and is co-chair of the IAP Expert Group on the COVID Expert Group, and a member of the Indian National Science Academy. So Gagandeep, the floor is yours. When you wish, I will then introduce also Professor Hak-Soo Kim, and then we can move to the discussion.
Thank you, Peter. I don't think we have a lot of time, so I'll keep my opening remarks really brief. I think we've had truly outstanding talks about how vaccines are made, what platforms we have, what we need to think about in terms of what contributes to hesitancy and how to handle misinformation. But I think for Academy members and for all scientists, it's very important to recognize that in most cases, misinformation is simple. It's well projected. It's very appealing. Whereas if we actually come up with data, then that data tends to be quite complicated, very uncertain, and very nuanced. And as scientists, we never overstate the case. So we create problems for ourselves in some ways, but that's how science works. And we need to make sure that when an unknown is an unknown, we find a way of explaining that we will be looking for information and providing clarity when the vacuum of information is filled. I think people tend to find content that reinforces their attitudes. So as scientists, what we need to do, particularly from the point of view of academies, is think about what we can do preemptively in order to be able to communicate better, how we can support people who are running vaccination programs in times of crisis, but also use this as an opportunity to build towards the future and think about how academies could be involved in framing science communication agendas that build what is known in the Indian Constitution as a scientific temper. And that applies, of course, beyond biology to all of our membership. We have about 55 minutes left. So I think this would be a great time, Peter, to bring Professor Soon forward and then move to the panel discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Gagandeep. I think while we're getting Professor Kim's slides on the screen for him, let me introduce him. He obtained his PhD in communication from the University of Washington, Seattle in the USA. Since then, he's been an international pioneer of theory and research on science communication and social science in general. He's currently Distinguished Professor at the College of Transdisciplinary Studies of the Daegu-Gyeongbuk Institute of Science and Technology and Emeritus Professor of Communication, Sogang University, both in South Korea. He's a fellow of the International Communication Association and the Korean Academy of Science and Technology. He was also founder and first chair of the Special Committee on Share and Communication. SHARE stands for Science, Health, Agriculture, Risk and Environment, of the network of academies for the Asia Pacific region, sort of one of the IAP regional networks. So Professor Kim, you're ready and your slides are there.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for inviting me in this important web seminar. This time, I'd like to focus on general public's perspective. Usually, in dealing with the COVID as well as other problems, usually we are likely to talk about information produced perspective, like academic's perspective or scientist perspective. But in this case, I am likely to focus on general actors' point of view. Okay. Oops. How can I move? All right. Okay, here you see that if you look at general public, general actor, move back the second slide. No, second slide. Yes, okay, thank you. And so you immediately realize there are two competing situational problems to general public. Health insecurity and job insecurity. Very, very serious situational problems, always to human beings, to the general public. And then we have, with the COVID-19, we lose balance between health and job. Look at the first stage, we have a higher, move back. Please move it. Okay, here, first stage, we have a serious concern about health, then concern with the job. When the coronavirus happened. Later, as the time is going on, we have a second stage. Job is more important than health because we lost the jobs. You see, and so there is no balance. And so every general public felt loss of a balance, which means that imbalance, means instability. Instability means that extreme anxiety. You see, that is a trauma. In this case, particularly with the COVID-19, we had a serious such kind of anxiety, extreme anxiety from imbalance between health and job. Let's do it. Third slide, please. Have a third slide. Okay, here. And then you see, I am bringing here now credulity, the concept of credulity instead of credibility. Concept of credibility, you might have heard a lot. That is information produced concept. For instance, expert has expertise and trustworthiness, and then the expert has a credibility. That is exactly kind of information produced perspective. Scientist perspective, for instance, expert perspective. But when we are talking about general public, the concept of credulity is applying much better. You see, and so in this extreme anxiety, extreme imbalance situation, the general public has incredulity against politicians' expertise, which was actually accumulated for a long time. You see, and so it is natural that the general public perceive something, whatever expert or politician say something about coronavirus as a conspiracy. It's very likely to consider whatever the saying from experts and politicians as a conspiracy. For instance, extensive measures to subdue other issues. This kind of conspiracy. And that situation, it is also so natural to general public. They construct their own information about problem as well as solution. So misinformation, this kind of, in this case, the concept of accuracy does not apply to the general public because they construct their own information, which may be different from the experts and politicians. But within their extreme imbalance situation, anxiety situation, losing balance between job and health, it is so natural to construct their own information about solutions, mask, vaccination, even relief fund. You see? And so without understanding this kind of general public situation, we cannot achieve any kind of a communication. That's why we have to reject a persuasive kind of a communication. And next slide, please. Okay, and so I am talking about what we need, teamwork between public and expert, which means that rather than decision making, rather than pushing decision making, we need to collective problem solving. We need a team problem solving between public and expert. So that's why I am saying that team communication between family doctor and family. And second part, I am talking about public team health service. Also is a team problem solving between health professionals and community. Not just conveying accurate information to community by health professionals. It doesn't work. Sometimes it works, but most time it doesn't work. And so the third, I am saying that thinking together exercise needed, not gap bridging. Oh, we like it so much. We talk about gap bridging so much. Gap bridging actually means that knowledge transferring from expert to the general public. What do you think? Do you believe knowledge transference is working? No, you have learned a lot. We studied a lot. It took so long time to learn something as a professional. To the general public within short time. How can you convey knowledge to the people? Impossible. But still we are talking about such kind of gap bridging or literacy campaign, learning process, that kind of things. No, it doesn't work. That's why I am developing new kind of a science communication, as well as a new kind of a team communication. That's why I am talking about we need to thinking together process. Otherwise, always it is not failing to have some common ground between public and expert. However, it is not easy to accomplish a team communication. It needs really sophisticated kind of a principled grammar, but nobody has developed that. So I have really devoted all my life to developing such kind of principled grammar for team communication from the general public's perspective, or I am calling that active perspective. So next slide, please. These are you may have some references about these kind of things. Quite new kind of perspective. Anyway, that's all my short presentation for general public's perspective. Thank you. Thank you so much.